Slavery, an age-old institution that has persisted across the globe in various forms for millennia, has touched the lives of people from all races, genders, and age groups. It wasn't until relatively recent times, with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, that the world collectively outlawed slavery and recognized it as a fundamental violation of human rights to be prohibited in all its manifestations. Throughout history, slavery has taken on many guises, including chattel slavery, bonded labor, forced labor, and sexual slavery. Despite the variations, certain key characteristics of slavery have remained consistent, such as the deprivation of freedom of movement and legal rights. In ancient civilizations, slavery emerged for a variety of reasons. Economic necessity played a significant role, especially in societies reliant on agriculture and large workforces. Conquest and domination also fueled the institution, with the spoils of war not only including riches, but also captives to be enslaved, eventually becoming symbols of status. The more slaves one possessed, the greater their wealth and influence. One of the earliest documented slave societies existed in the Mesopotamian and Sumerian civilizations, situated in the Iran-Iraq region between 6000 - 2000 BCE. The first written reference to slavery appears in the Hammurabi Code of 1754 BCE, which decreed severe punishment for those who took slaves beyond the city gates. Egypt, another civilization heavily reliant on slavery, had laws governing the relationships between slaves and masters. Certain restrictions were placed on slave owners, such as forbidding child slaves from engaging in excessively strenuous labor. Unlike some other ancient societies, Egypt lacked formal slave markets, and any transactions involving slaves had to be overseen by government officials. The biblical narrative of the Exodus, where the Israelites were led to freedom by Moses, is one of the earliest known accounts of slaves gaining their freedom. Ancient Greece can be considered one of the world's first true slave societies, with the majority of its economy dependent on slave labor. Slaves constituted roughly a third of the population, and manual labor was viewed with disdain by the wealthier classes. However, Greece did offer a form of manumission for slaves, allowing them to purchase their freedom or be freed at their master's discretion. Despite this, freed slaves were not granted full citizenship rights, and many still had obligations to their former masters. Ethical questions about slavery began to emerge, with figures like Bishop Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century AD arguing against its compatibility with humanity's creation in the image of God. With the decline of Greece and the rise of Rome, slavery continued to expand. At the height of the Roman Empire, up to 30% of the population were enslaved, primarily consisting of conquered peoples. Rome also saw the emergence of slavery for purposes beyond labor, including gladiatorial fights and large-scale brothels. Slave revolts were not uncommon, met with strict rules and even harsher punishments. However, some slaves operated as skilled craftsmen and women, working as hairdressers, painters, and tutors to children. One notable difference from Greece was that in Rome, freed slaves could become full legal Roman citizens. The fall of the Roman Empire marked the onset of the Dark Ages or medieval period. With the collapse of the Roman Empire came the decline of large-scale markets. The fate of Roman slaves remains uncertain, with theories suggesting that their prices plummeted or they were left to fend for themselves. In Britain, the transition was slow, eventually leading to the emergence of serfdom. One noteworthy figure during this time was Balthild, an English slave who rose to become the queen of the Frankish king Clovis II in the 7th century. As queen regent for her young son, she abolished the trading of Christian slaves and freed all young child slaves. During the Anglo-Saxon era, slavery persisted, especially during Viking invasions and conquests of large parts of the island. Vikings engaged in slave markets, with the largest in Dublin. Bristol also had a thriving Viking slave market before becoming infamous for its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Viking slaves were primarily captives or war spoils, often kidnapped during raids. These slaves had no rights and were treated as commodities, subjected to random violence and horrific rituals. Following the Norman conquest of Britain in 1066, the Domesday Book, a tax survey, revealed that around 10% of the British population were classified as slaves. In 1102, the Church condemned slavery, although it lacked legislative power. Despite this, slave markets persisted. Cultural attitudes towards slavery began to shift, with early abolitionists like Bishop Wulfstan of Worcester preaching against the practice. By the 1200s, slavery, as previously defined, had largely disappeared from the British Isles. The decline of traditional slavery in Western nations marked the rise of serfdom during the medieval period. Serfs were distinct from slaves as they were not considered property and were entitled to some protection and justice. However, they lacked freedom of movement and were bound to their lord and the land, required to provide tribute in the form of labor or payment for shelter and other services. The Black Death in the 14th century played a pivotal role in the decline of serfdom, as a reduced population and increased demand for workers allowed serfs to negotiate for their freedom and better wages. Some regions, like Eastern Europe and Russia, retained serfdom until the 19th century. Indentured servitude emerged during the colonial era, where individuals entered fixed-term servitude contracts, often as a means of escaping capital punishment or gaining passage to the Americas. Indentured servants had restricted freedoms, could not marry without consent, lacked freedom of movement, and received limited justice in courts. If a female indentured servant became pregnant during her contract, additional time was added to her servitude. Indentured servitude coexisted with the transatlantic slave trade in the 17th, 18th, and part of the 19th centuries. As the demand for indentured labor decreased, a new labor force was needed, leading to the infamous African slave trade. Slavery in Africa had existed for thousands of years, and many African rulers engaged in the trade with Europeans to obtain goods not locally available. The Portuguese were among the first Western slavers in Africa, capturing the African port of Ceuta in 1415. Initially, native African slave trading was limited, as the Portuguese and Spanish enslaved native populations in the Americas. However, as the indigenous populations declined due to European diseases, the demand for African labor increased, particularly in large-scale sugar production. This shift is often seen as a catalyst for the transatlantic slave trade's growth. Notably, there were voices such as Bartolomé de las Casas in the 1500s opposing the enslavement of Africans. Between the early 1400s and the mid-17th century, the Spanish and Portuguese dominated the transatlantic slave trade. The British did not establish their own colonies until the late 17th century, leading them to look for other markets while Spain guarded the trade. However, with the peace between Spain and Britain, the British entered the slave trade, which flourished with the growth of British colonies in the Caribbean and the Americas. Bristol served as a major port for commerce related to the slave trade between 1720 and 1740, before Liverpool took over as the dominant port until the abolition of slavery in the early 19th century. In total, an estimated 3.4 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and shipped across the Atlantic. Other forms of slave trade persisted, such as the Barbary pirate raids on various European countries, including Britain. Ordinary people were forcibly taken from ports and villages and transported to North Africa. Between 1500 and 1900, an estimated 1.2 million Europeans were enslaved and lost in the Ottoman Empire. The trade declined after the United States, Great Britain, and other European nations waged a war against the pirates in the early 19th century. Ultimately, it ended after France conquered and colonized the North African region. Slavery gradually disappeared from Western nations during the 19th century, becoming fully outlawed globally in the 20th century through United Nations resolutions. Nevertheless, some countries continued to practice slavery even into the 1980s. Tragically, slavery has evolved and persisted in different forms, with human trafficking and people smuggling remaining lucrative trades well into the 21st century. It is estimated that there are currently 40 million victims of slavery worldwide, with the majority being women subjected to sex trafficking.